So when I talked to Paul earlier, I said I wanted to kind of take a little bit of the contrarian view to start with and challenge the assumption that this idea of decisive victory is not inevitable. And I might turn that around and say that, endless wars are not inevitable. But I think there are kind of three components to dealing with this to ensure that we don't find ourselves in these endless wars. And there's nothing rocket science about them. The fact of the matter is, first and foremost, you have to have a clear strategy. But I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about that because I think we've made some fundamental mistakes over certainly in the last 20 or so years. You have to have strong leadership. And then the other part of this, and certainly as we see it from the United States, and I think it probably applies in militaries everywhere, is the public has to be invested in the war. Not just interested in the war, but invested in the war. So let me kind of take those and break them apart quickly here. So, I do want to quote Clausewitz. I think every military leader needs to start off with a quote from Clausewitz. And this is probably more a paraphrase than a quote. But in his book on war, he said, everything in war is easy. It's just the easy things are difficult. Everything in war is easy. It's just the easy things are difficult. I was telling the story the other day when I was a three-star admiral in Afghanistan. I was heading from the United States back to Afghanistan. And this was 2009. And I was reading some kind of foreign policy magazine. And there were two articles by a couple of very prominent PhDs, East Coast Ivy League PhDs. And this was the time when we had changed. We had begun to surge into Afghanistan. And so these PhDs were providing us their wisdom on what the military needed to do. And frankly, their wisdom was a little bit condescending, but I was reading the articles and they said, and both of them independently said, the military just doesn't get it. If they would only build roads in Afghanistan, they could win this war because the roads could connect, the villages to the district to the province, to the central government. If they could only build roads, well, no shit. Why didn't we think about that? Well, the answer is we did think about that. It's just when people are shooting at you and trying to blow you up, it's a little hard to build roads. Everything in war is easy. It's just the easy things are difficult. So it is easy to sit here and say you need a strategy, you need a strong leader, the people need to be invested. It's just hard to do. But I would offer, if you go back in at least the late 20th century for the United States and you look at how we confronted a number of the issues, Grenada, Panama, Kosovo, Bosnia, and then Desert Storm. I mean, those were kind of the sort of wars that had a short-lived time frame because we had very, very clear strategies on how we were going to approach them. We had an exit strategy, we had an entrance strategy, and we had an exit strategy. But I will also offer that, if war is this extension of policy or politics, as Clausewitz says, then you've got to start off with a very clear and thoughtful objectives. And I would offer you have to do this at all levels of warfare. So it's not just about having a grand strategy or strategy. You better think about the strategic, the operational, and the tactical, or you're going to get yourself in a lot of problems. And I would offer Afghanistan as a little bit of an example of that. As we went into Afghanistan, of course, our objective was really to ensure that Afghanistan was not a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. And those were, that was a pretty clear objective at the kind of the strategic level. We don't want Afghanistan to be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. But if we had thought through that down to the tactical level and realized that in order for Afghanistan not to be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, that meant that we were going to have to own every piece of terrain. And in owning every piece of terrain, we were going to have to engage in a war with the Taliban. And so while the overarching objectives were honorable and noble and the right thing to do, we may not have thought all the way through it. And as a result, we go in, we obviously, kick the Taliban out of power, we put Karzai in, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves entrenched in this kind of endless war because frankly, we had mission creep. We allowed ourselves to be trapped into the broader issue of ridding the Taliban because I would offer, we probably didn't think far enough ahead in terms of the tactical aspects of what was going to be required in order to achieve the strategic goals. So again, you have to kind of think through this at all those levels. Next, you have to have strong leadership. And that sounds intuitive. Of course, you want strong leadership. But when I think of strong leadership at the political level, it is best to have somebody that you hope is experienced, that is educated, that is thoughtful, that listens to the counsel of the generals and the admirals and the other political leaders, that understands the history and the culture and grasps the limits of power of the US or any other country, and that is careful about the hubris. You know, all of us that have been part of countries where you are the great superpower, you have this sense that we can go and do anything. And the fact of the matter is, history clearly shows that is not the case. And then as a great leader, you've got to be able to confront the kind of slings and arrows that are going to come your way. You're going to have to be able to confront the criticism. And the best example I've seen in modern times of that actually is George Herbert Walker Bush for Desert Storm. So you think about President Bush at the time, exceptionally experienced. He had been not only the vice president, he had been the director of the CIA. He had been the ambassador to China. So he was experienced. He was highly educated at Yale. A very thoughtful guy. He listened to the counsel of both General Schwarzkopf and General Powell. He understood the culture and the history of the region. A guy that didn't have a particularly big ego. But then the thing that I think was most important was, as you may recall, as we went into, again, the objectives were clear. We wanted to get Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis out of Kuwait. The objective was not to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And as you recall, there was a lot of criticism at the end of this 100-day war. Well, why didn't you just march to Baghdad? Well, I would offer that a lot of leaders would have gone on, felt that pressure, and decided to march to Baghdad. But Bush had very clear objectives. Look, we're here to exercise a UN resolution, get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. That is our objective. We'll get that done. And I'm not going to be pressured into mission creep, because had he gone on to try to push Saddam out, we may have found ourselves in the same position we were in post 9/11. So strong leadership is important. And then finally, this idea that the public has to be invested. You know, we in the United States, of course, have not had a draft since the mid 70s. And as a result, what you find is, you know, less than 1% of the American population is in the military. And while the American people in particular have been very, very supportive of the military, and certainly after 9/11, you know, the American public just embraced the military in a way that I hadn't seen in all the years I served in uniform. But for most of the Americans, they didn't have somebody that was invested in the war. You know, the elite of America, most of their children didn't go fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the reason I think we had this endless war was because American boys and girls were over there fighting, but back in the United States, we were still concerned about the Super Bowl, and we were concerned about, you know, the day-to-day activity. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, but when the war overseas does not affect you domestically in a way that really gets to your heart, and again, I don't want to imply that the American people weren't conscious of the losses. They were, but as a nation, they weren't fully invested, and that allowed us to, I think, continue on in a war that kind of turned it almost into this endless fight. So once again, you know, everything in war is easy. It's just the easy things are difficult. It is easy to stand up here and to say that we need a clear strategy, we need strong leaders, and we need to have the people invested in the war. It's just hard to do. And with that, Paul, I'll turn it over to the other panelists, and I'm anxiously awaiting their points and look forward to discussing this further.